Today I'm delighted to introduce Professor Matthew Marr of the Florida International University in beautiful and warm Miami. He is at the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies and Asian Studies program, and I've been there once, and it has a really nice and very vibrant Asian Studies program in which Japan is very, very prominent, right? The most popular topic of research and degree for students there. Okay? And he's the associate professor and associate chair of that department. He's an ethnographer, trained as a sociologist at the University of California, UCLA. And he's been teaching at Florida International University, and his research has been on homelessness in Japan and comparative study on homelessness. And he's published a book in 2015, Better Must Come, Exiting Homelessness in Two Global Cities, from the Cornell University Press. And he's here today to present on his current research, the research that's been done after this excellent book. And the talk is titled Neighborhoods of Refuge, Gentrification and Ontological Security in Japan's Declining Yoseba. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Matthew Marr.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming today and listening to the talk. And thank you especially to Kyo and Professor Tsutsui for inviting me. It's really an honor to be speaking here with a great group of students and faculty and community folks interested in Japan. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to present my research and hear some feedback and questions, critiques, and things like that. And just to share a little Floridian in Michigan anecdotes. When I was leaving Miami Beach yesterday, it was 75 degrees and sunny skies, and I'm lugging my my big winter coats and looking at the people passing by me, and a guy in a bathing suit riding a bike, like 3/4 naked. But Professor Tsutsui warned me about the icy roads and things like that, so I brought my winter boots and I put them on. Took them out of storage. They'd been in storage for 10 years, basically, and didn't try them on until I was getting ready to leave the hotel, and I started to walk out of the hotel room, and the soles fell off. They were so old, and I guess the humidity had disintegrated things, and so I had to put my sneakers on. But I guess variety is the spice of life, so I'm glad to experience a little bit of different weather today, but I'll be getting back to the warmth in a little bit. So let me get into my talk here. I just wanted to start out a little bit to see if anybody recognizes the places in these pictures. Does anybody know where they are? Any guesses? I guess.
We were guessing the one on the
right.
Right, thank you. It was a church, possibly?
It was built by a Christian group, but it is a labor center. If you read kanji, Sonia is the name of the neighborhood in Tokyo. It's the labor center in Sonia. The picture on the right, anybody from Kansai? That's Kamagasaki in Osaka. It's Triangle Park is the name of the park. But these are two kind of central spaces in these two neighborhoods in these big cities in Japan. But the neighborhoods are known as Yoseba. I don't know if anybody's kind of heard that term. It's not a common term in Japanese, but academics use it to describe these neighborhoods. But it combines the characters for yoseru, to bring together, and ba is a place. But the idea is basically it's a place where labor was gathered together to be exploited by capital. And these neighborhoods, I use the term day labor ghettos. They're basically in the post-war period established by official policies and market forces for places to be places where day laborers lived, and construction companies would kind of come through intermediaries who were often affiliated with Boryokudan or Yakuza to hire day laborers, but they were also kind of communities of day laborers as well. But like the title suggests, they're in decline. A lot of the laborers have aged, and so they're not as useful a source of labor, and the construction industry has changed, so when they hire casual workers, it's all done by phones, so they don't really need these neighborhoods. And so they're really changing quite a bit, but they're still there. There's still a lot of men there, mostly men. And my research looks at how these neighborhoods are changing and how the residents themselves are impacted. That's really the broad focus of my research. I refer to them as neighborhoods of refuge, and in Japanese I use this term kakikomi chiki. It's kind of a play on the term kakikomi dera, or for like a Buddhist temple, and I think there was a specific temple in the Kamakura period that was known as kakikomi dera. And kakekomu basically means to kind of flee. And Tokeiji in the Kamakura period was known as a kakikomi dera, and it was a place where women who were fleeing bad marriages or prostitution or something like that, they could go to the temple, and it was a place where they could kind of seek refuge and kind of reestablish some stability in their lives and things like that. Some academics who know about Yoseba, Japanese, especially Japanese studies folks, know about Sonia from Ted Fowler's book called Sonia Blues. It used to be assigned a lot in Japan studies courses, but it's maybe a little dated. But he didn't refer to Sonia as a kakikomi chiki or a neighborhood of refuge, but he did describe the neighborhood in this way. So he said, for day laborers, it is a refuge, a symbol of defeat perhaps, but at the same time a cradle of opportunity which holds the possibility, however slim, of a second chance in a society that is most stingy with its second chances. Located in an easily accessible section of town, it beckons the laid-off worker or stray migrant from the provinces, or the man on the run from creditors, or the gambling addict, or ex-con, or ex-gangster, with its lures of liquor, gambling, casual sex, anonymity, and most important, a ready income. So these neighborhoods like Sanya and Kamagasaki, there's also Kotobukicho and Yokohama, they're often looked at as really kind of places to avoid from the outside perspective, but for the residents themselves, they kind of served as a refuge. And if you look at urban studies kind of over a wide span of time, there's been neighborhoods like this across the world in a lot of cities where kind of outsiders can kind of find a place of community. And so I'm kind of using that concept but applying it to the current times and looking at these neighborhoods to see if they, for the residents themselves, if they do still serve as a place of refuge. So these are just some key concepts that I'm using in my research and that kind of organize my research questions. These neighborhoods in the urban studies literature are referred to as service hubs. Other terms that are used for these neighborhoods are service-dependent ghettos. In America, we'll often call them skid rows. They're in Japanese called Yoseba or Doya gai. I'll get to what a doya is in a second. But they're generally urban neighborhoods, stigmatized but centrally located, where single-room occupancy hotels or residential hotels, in Japanese and Yoseba slang, they're called doya. And street homelessness, receipt of welfare, supportive services, and social movements are clustered. And I do comparative research, like Professor Tsutsui mentioned. And this urban welfare regime is kind of a concept I look at comparatively. So if there's sociologists in the audience, you might be familiar with Esping Anderson's welfare regime that basically looks at how different countries across the world have different ways that markets and the state and families kind of interact to form social safety nets and to mitigate against risk. I add to that, at the urban level, there's also differences. So within countries, there is a welfare regime, but that can even differ locally according to how different cities kind of manage poverty. In addition to Sonia in Tokyo and Kamagasaki in Osaka, part of my research is on Skid Row, Los Angeles, and Overtown in Miami. But today I'll just talk about the two Japanese examples. And so I look at how those urban conditions affect the local service hub, and in turn how that service hub affects the human security of the residents. This is a definition of human security, but I really focus on the individual level, kind of the subjective dimensions of security, the extent to which people feel secure, since ethnographic methods, I think, really gets at that the best. So, these subjective perceptions of security, and how do people feel about these neighborhoods? Do they feel like they're a jail without bars and just these really stigmatized ghettos, or are they a neighborhood of refuge? This is kind of like my argument slide. Across the cases, I try to argue for the strengths of these neighborhoods, although there are weaknesses, and we can certainly touch on those, especially in the Q&A. But with a lot of cheap housing and social services in a single neighborhood, that can be efficient in terms of social service delivery. Like if, say you're a recovering alcoholic and you're living in subsidized housing, and the alcohol treatment center is right across the street, or your mental health services are right down the way, and cheap food and things are all in this neighborhood, there's some effects of it can promote effective service delivery. Also, these neighborhoods are centrally located in cities, so they provide marginalized groups with a right to the city. That's a big concept in urban studies. So it provides basically marginalized and poor people with the access to the benefits of living in a city, or the benefits of urbanism. Also, in these neighborhoods, there's often a sense of community that encourages social participation. So a lot of the men who have come to these neighborhoods and been helped by different social services in Japan often use the word ongaishi, like they want to give something back to the community. So they'll often volunteer in the neighborhoods. Also, these neighborhoods provide a source of identity, and that can have benefits to mental health and psychological benefits. Sometimes the men talk about being yama no otoko, like a man of Sonia, or kama no otoko, and they have that identity of being a neighborhood resident, which can bolster feelings of security. Also, these neighborhoods tend to attract a lot of resources, and I like this concept of a vicarious citizen. I'm kind of one of them. I didn't grow up in Sonia or Kamagasaki. I have stayed there before, but a lot of people from outside these neighborhoods go there to participate in social services, or in philanthropic activity, and also political activism. There can be some negatives to some of these as well, but I'm going to try to highlight some of the positives. The spaces are also multi-religious. As you noticed in the first slide, there's a lot of Christian groups that work in these neighborhoods. I'm also going to try to talk a little bit today about a resurgence of Buddhist activism in these neighborhoods. But a lot of people with religious motivations, as well as people with more secular motivations, interact in these spaces, and you can say that it promotes a certain kind of ethical citizenship, where people from different backgrounds kind of form new ethics together, ethics of citizenship. And also, these neighborhoods have been argued to be resilient to gentrification, because a lot of the spaces in the city, in these neighborhoods, are owned by religious organizations or local governments. It's not a bulletproof way to prevent gentrification, but a lot of these groups do resist the temptation to sell to developers and things like that, and they persist. So these are some of the strengths, and I'll try to demonstrate some of them throughout the talk. But in Japan, there's actually a really minor area of research called Yoseba Kenkyu. And so this is kind of like Yoseba Kenkyu 101, like what is a doya? For those of you who speak Japanese, it's an inversion of the syllables in yado, which just means like an inn. And the idea is basically these are so simple and cheap, they don't deserve the label of yado, so people call them doya. It's slang. I made the mistake of referring to one of these places as a doya to a doya owner, and they got very mad. But the rooms are generally about 2 tatami or 2.5 tatami big, and so this is a room that I stayed in once, and I could lay down and bang my head on one wall and touch the 2 walls on the side and almost touch the wall. Bigger than a capsule hotel, but still pretty small, and they rent by the day. For day laborers, some of them were as cheap as 500 yen. These days, the price is more, especially in Tokyo, around 2,000 yen per night. But the idea was that day laborers, you could work a day, you could be completely broke in the morning, get hired and work a day, come home with 12,000 yen or something like that, and be able to pay for your room and food and things like that, and repeat that the next day. But doyagai is the term used for these neighborhoods, and this is Sonia, and you can see the signs for all the doya on this particular street. But these doya have changed quite a lot in recent decades, and they've been converted. There's kind of 2 major routes. Some have been converted into simple hotels for tourists, and some have been converted into supportive housing, or as they say in Japanese, supportive housing. But this shows the concept of supportive housing. There's actually a manga artist who was a social worker in Kamagasaki for decades, and he drew this. But he's published a number of manga about Kamagasaki that are pretty interesting. But the idea is that people will come from either homelessness or a care facility or a hospital and have nowhere else to go, and be placed in supportive housing, and where they provide wraparound services, so health care, day service, and other forms of supportive services, legal services, and things like that. And they'll either stay there until perhaps death, or they can move into apartments. And they're often supported, or not often, but always supported by seikatsu hogo benefits, and that's livelihood protection benefits that exist in Japan that don't exist in the US. Basically, in the past, there was a lot of quote-unquote street-level bureaucracy, where if you went to a welfare office, and especially if you were a poor man or a day laborer, you'd generally be rejected and turned away. You'd just be told to go look for work. But through a lot of legal activism in the late 90s and early 2000s, welfare offices really kind of changed their approach and put a lot of people on welfare. So if you're even an able-bodied male of working age, and you're just completely poor, I mean, they'll try to get your family to help you first, but generally you can get welfare benefits, and they'll put you in housing, or there's sometimes people are sent to shelters, but if you're fortunate to have an activist along with you, you get put in some of the supportive housing, and your housing is paid for, and you also get money to live off of. But with all the doom and gloom talk about Japan these days, I always try to push the seikatsu hogo system is actually a really good functioning social safety net that doesn't exist in the United States. And because of that, homelessness in Japan has decreased quite a bit, although there's a lot of hidden homelessness in internet cafes and things like that. But street homelessness has decreased. So just a real broad introduction to these two neighborhoods. On the right, on your left is the Labor and Welfare Center in Kamagasaki. It's going to be torn down later this month and rebuilt in another location, and that's part of the gentrification story that I'll get into in a second. This is the Johoku Rodo Fukushi Center in Sonia, the Johoku Labor and Welfare Center in Sonia. I haven't heard much talk about it being torn down yet, but they painted it this interesting kind of like nice color recently to try to change the image. They don't really provide much introductions to jobs these days. It's mostly welfare services, but you can still see this is some posters and information from the labor union there, so that you can still see some of the activism there. This just to give you an idea of where these neighborhoods are located and to highlight, how they're centrally located. This is Sonia here, and it's right outside the Yamanote line, so it's a very convenient location. But there's some interesting things about where these neighborhoods are located and similarities between the two. So. They're both in convenient locations. They're also really proximate to different social minorities and where they tend to cluster. So around Sonia is Imado, which is a buraku in Tokyo. And also really close by is Mikawashima, and that's a neighborhood where there's a lot of resident Koreans. And also, these neighborhoods tend to be close to entertainment districts and red light districts. So Sonia is very close to Yoshiwara, which is a red light district in that side of Tokyo. And it's also very close to Ueno and Asakusa. And this is just a screenshot from Google Maps of Osaka. But similarly, Kamagasaki is located really close to Shinima-miya Station on the Kanjo line in Osaka, which circles Osaka, kind of like the Yamanote in Tokyo. There's a really great group of scholars at Osaka City University that study Osaka and all of its diversity, and they refer to this kind of crescent of Osaka right here as Japan's deep south, is what they call it, the deep south of Osaka. And the reason why they use that term is Kamagasaki is the biggest day labor neighborhood in Japan. And then there is Asahihara, which is, I think, the largest buraku in Japan. And Taisho Station is said to have the largest population of Okinawans outside of Okinawa. And Tsuruhashi, in addition to having wonderful Korean barbecue and all sorts of Korean food, is, of course, a neighborhood of the largest concentration of resident Koreans in Japan. But also, there's these entertainment districts like Tennoji. It's very similar to Ueno, and Shinsekai is kind of very similar to Asakusa. And Japan's largest open air, it's just really open air prostitution. If anybody's seen it, Tobita Shinchi is right here, right next to Kamagasaki, where there's just a few hundred quote unquote tea houses there. So it's very interesting to me, at least, some of these similarities. But they have similar histories as well, and they're also seeing similar changes, like a declining population, an aging population, and advancing gentrification. I know this slide has a little too much detail maybe for the eye, but just to highlight how these are kind of clusters of cheap housing and social services. So on the Sonia map, these aren't directly comparable, but all the orange and pink are Doya. So you can see there's a really cluster of Doya. And some of the other things on this map are social, private and public social services. On this map of Kamagasaki, some of these highlighted areas are either public spaces. This is a the Rodo Fukushi-senta. There's a lot of social services highlighted here. Kinshu no Kan, a place for recovering from alcoholism. Furusato no Ie, that's actually where I did a lot of my observation. But a lot of the white spaces here, it's just all Doya, all of these residential hotels. So here's just some really broad data to compare the two places. Sonia is actually bigger than Kamagasaki in terms of space and population, but in terms of people on welfare, there's a larger concentration in Kamagasaki, and a larger number of people and a larger number of Doya in Kamagasaki than Sonia. So Kamagasaki, you can just think it's a real big one. Sonia is kind of a smaller neighborhood of refuge. And part of this is historical. In Kamagasaki, they had in Osaka, they had a really strong policy of containment. They wanted all of this, and this is going back decades and decades. They moved poor neighborhoods, slums, into a specific part of the city, and they wanted to contain it there. In Tokyo, there were Yoseba spread out through the area. In addition to one in Yokohama, there was a Yoseba in Takadanobaba. So they did follow a policy of containment, but not as rigidly as or as intensely as Kamagasaki. Since I'm a sociologist, I have to say a little bit about research methods, basically what I did to study these places. I did participant observation in what I'll call drop-in centers in these neighborhoods. In Tokyo, it was a free medical clinic that was open to the street to anyone to come in to consult on getting assistance. And in Kamagasaki, it was a similar place where they just were open places for people to spend time during the day, as well as to try to get assistance. But I would go there about twice a week, spend the whole day there over about a 3-month period. In addition to that, I did some qualitative interviews, and those were stratified by housing status. So I wanted to talk to some people who were living on the streets, some people who were living in what we'd call maybe transitional programs, and then people that were in more stable housing, people that were in subsidized housing or supportive housing. And then I contextualized this with a lot of secondary materials and participating in observing in community meetings. And also over the last 25 years, I've been going to these places and I've lived in the neighborhoods on and off while I've gone there, but it has been intermittent over a 25-year period. I did the same in Skid Row, LA, and Miami as well. But like I said, today I'll just be talking about Tokyo and Osaka. And I know Tsutsui sensei does a lot of these in-depth comparative case studies with multiple groups, so I'm still building up to that big comparison, but in the meantime, I've broken off just a couple things that I found interesting in these neighborhoods, and so I'll present those. I'm not really going to do a direct comparison here. So first off is a paper that should be coming out soon in the journal Ethnography, but it is about this communal grave in Sonia that was put together by the free medical clinic that I volunteered at. They were, it's a private, officially non-religious organization, but it was founded by Maryknoll Catholics, and there's still a lot of Catholic clergy and Catholic volunteers that are involved. But they worked with a Buddhist temple in Sonia to create this communal grave. And the idea was that these men are all aging. They're completely separated from their families. Most have completely severed ties with their families. And so in Japanese Buddhism, if you die without a grave to go into, you end up becoming what they call a muen botoke, or a floating or disconnected soul, and you kind of float in the afterlife, all kind of disconnected. Possibly you could come back as a ghost or something like that. So the idea for this project was let's create a dignified grave so these men don't have to become floating souls. So it was this interesting Catholic-Buddhist collaboration. And in the article, I get into some kind of theory with Foucault and some complex stuff, but I'll try to just say what I was arguing in simple English and not get too into the jargon. I was really interested in how the men perceive this grave, and a real skeptic of the project could say, these nonprofit organizations, they're just they're like poverty businesses, and they just kind of use the men to get resources and legitimacy to pay their staff salaries and things like that. But I take a more kind of positive view on the grave and look at how it affects the sense of security in life and the afterlife of these men. So this is what one man said, who was planning on going into the grave after he died. At the very least, I won't just be tossed aside when I die. I think this gives me a sense of security, and you use that term anshin. I won't be lonely. People I know will be next to me in the grave, so it will be very lively, nigiyaka. A lot of times the men would talk about like literally being in the grave with their friends and having a good time. It was kind of interesting as a Westerner, as an American. I was thinking, after you die, you don't have fun with your friends, but they really saw themselves as being in the grave together and having this nigiyaka time. At least it's better than being next to a complete stranger, and knowing that the priest is there for everyone, not just to me. I think that's the best thing, that the grave is there for everyone. So, this term Necro Sociality is basically how the living have social relationships with the deceased, and how those relationships can even affect the relationships among the living as well. And I argue that that's going on here. I also look at this as post-secular social service delivery, and I look at how the specific neighborhood enabled this unique project. So the post-secular part of it, without getting too complicated about this, it was one of the most interesting interviews for this was with the Buddhist priest who was one of the organizers of the project, and he was a priest a young priest. He was the assistant head priest at Koshoin, a very small temple in Sonia. It's a Jodoshu temple, and he's in his mid-30s, but I'd always noticed that there weren't many Buddhist groups that were active in any of these neighborhoods, and I asked him a bit about that, and he said that up until about 10 years ago, he literally looked at the men in the neighborhood as being less than human. He used the words ningen janai. He didn't think that they were human. And I asked him a little bit why he thought that way, and he said, well, my grandfather, when he was head of the temple before the war, the temple was very socially active, and Buddhist temples in that part of Tokyo were very socially active. But because of the war, that was one reason he gave for kind of the temples retreating from interacting with government and things like that. But more so than that, he pointed to student activism in Sonia in the 60s as kind of pushing the Buddhist groups away a little bit. And a lot of the temple, or his specific temple in Sonia, with a lot of student groups coming to Sonia and organizing laborers in the 60s, and there were riots and things like that. A lot of the local residents kind of saw the men, the day laborers, and the student activists as just troublemakers, and they really distanced themselves from that, and so they didn't participate in any kind of social activism for a few decades. But then he was invited to a Obon festival in the summer. It was actually in Shinjuku, to preside over a ceremony for men who had died and who were basically going to become muen botoke. And these were all people who were formerly homeless. And he started talking to people and realized that they were, human, and that he had been mistaken this whole time. And so he started becoming socially active. And now he leads an outreach in that side of Tokyo, a street outreach, and he's helped a lot of people. He's started a Kodomo no Shokudo, a cafeteria for children who might not have a place to go after school or who are poor. I don't know if you all are familiar with that movement in Japan that's kind of growing, but he's participating in that. But this quote here is from a board member of the Free Medical Clinic, and he basically was pointing out how that it was really Sonia that created this interesting grave, and it was that the organization could have done this in a public graveyard, but it was actually better to have a non-religious grave in a Buddhist temple graveyard. Because it kind of symbolizes the uniqueness of Sonia and captures the scent of Sonia. And he was kind of being I don't know if sarcastic is the best word, but oftentimes people who first come to Sonia or Kamagasaki comment on the smell, because sometimes it smells like urine, because people sometimes pee on the streets. He's doing a little bit of a play on that a little. So I think I'm trying to highlight here how the unique neighborhood kind of produced this unique project. But just to wrap this part of the talk up, I try to argue that this project is an example of what I call resistant necropolitics. And so this is a play on a term used by a scholar named Membe, who talks about necropolitics as how governments use death to kind of oppress certain segments of the population. It's maybe a simple explanation, but this is how maybe social movement groups use relationships around death to protest against maybe oppressive social structures. So what are they protesting against here? It's basically against this kind of patrilineal model of Necro Sociality, where in Japan only families maintain graves, and it's all based on this Ie model that's male-centered. But they're pointing out that model doesn't really work for everybody in Japan anymore. And you can think of in broader Japanese society how the burden of maintaining family graves is really difficult, and so they're proposing a new model of a grave, a community grave. One reason why I argue that this is political is that they said that they could have built this grave just with donations from their usual donors, but they wanted to make a public event out of it. So they did crowdfunding, and so they put it all online and made it very public. It got media attention and things like that, and they're really kind of challenging this mainstream model of the male-centered Ie and family model. And one example of how maybe it resonated politically is that there were LGBT groups who contacted them and expressed that their membership had a similar problem of being kind of disowned and kicked out of, unable to enter their family graves, and that they wanted to replicate this in their own group to create a community grave. So the organizers of this are very humble about their project, but I see it as this big political thing, resistant political thing that they were doing. Just to shift over to a different topic and talk more about Kamagasaki and Osaka. I mentioned both neighborhoods are seeing gentrification. The picture on the right is of Sonia. The two yellow buildings are Doya, as well as the gray building, smaller building next to it. But you can see the big apartment building right behind, and then you have the sky tree off in the distance as well. But in Sonia, there are a lot of these manshon, as they're called in Japanese, these high, tall buildings that have been built in the neighborhood. And I think that's kind of the main form of gentrification that you see going on there. And Minami Senju is the station closest to Sonia in Tokyo, and it's now being pitched as like a very desirable place to live in Tokyo. In the past, people wanted to avoid it. but it is kind of really changing in this way. But it's changed slowly over the years. In Osaka, things are really happening much quicker recently, and it's changing. Sonia is a little bit in the same way, changing into more of a tourist hub. So the quote here at the bottom is from a professor of tourism studies in Osaka, and he's really promotes the tourism that's going on in the neighborhood and the conversion of these doya to cater more towards international travelers. And he wants to make Kamagasaki, or Shin Imamiya is the station right there, as a hub, a tourist hub for Western Japan. And so that's kind of rapidly going on. And these are just a few kind of anecdotal pictures that highlight some of the gentrification. But this is the first floor of a doya in Kamagasaki, and it's they have a cycle-up window to get coffee, and most of the signs are in English. And it doesn't really cater to the traditional like day labor population. They're not really into espressos and things like that. So you see a lot of signs in English, as well as Chinese and Korean. This is the Thieves Market, Doroboichi. In Kamagasaki, it's gotten smaller and smaller. And there's a lot of crackdowns in the neighborhood, but this used to be really, really big. It went down for several blocks and would stay open all day. But and there were like little yatai, little food stalls that sold food and drink and things like that. All of that is being kind of shut down and condensed. And this is the labor center, the side of the labor center. The picture on the left is over here is from 2014, and this is 2016. But you know, this just looks like a bunch of trash to most people. But it's actually, for some people, it's their tools of labor. Like recyclers would generally have their bikes and everything else that they needed for recycling there. But they cleared it all out, and now they have bicycle parking there. One of the things that they want to clean up in the neighborhood is there's just bikes all over the place. They want that organized more neatly, and a lot of that's for tourism. But they put up these nice little neat bicycle parking spaces, and it's all organized with these nice signs and stuff, but they're all in English, and so it's clearly not for the day laborers and other residents of the neighborhood, but more for tourists. And I don't think these days you can have gentrification without wall art. And I don't know if anybody listens to Japanese hip hop, but Shingo Nishinari is one of my favorite rappers in the world, but he's from Nishinari, and he's very active in the neighborhood. He's always performing at the summer festivals. Even the old men who you'd think would be into enka and not hip hop, a lot of them love him and love his performances in the neighborhood. He teamed up with Red Bull to do a big wall art project, bringing in graffiti artists, and actually some of them have come from like Brazil to come paint murals in the neighborhood. His take on it is it's beautifying the neighborhood, turning it into a colorful neighborhood rather than a sepia-toned neighborhood. And he has a really positive take on it, but you could look at it skeptically that they're just kind of putting up these murals. They're not really. It's not in the taste of the men of the neighborhood, I would say. It's more directed towards tourists or young folks and things like that. But just one way of, I think this picture kind of captures some of the changes in the neighborhood. You still have these folks working as recyclers and stuff like that, but the neighborhood is rapidly kind of changing around them. But one thing that's really motivating or pushing a lot of the changes in the neighborhood is there was, and this is in contrast to Sonia, but in Kamagasaki, there was a specific government-initiated project to change the neighborhood, and it's called Nishinari Toku Koso. Nishinari is the bigger ward. Kamagasaki is actually a small part of it, but it was initially created by Mayor Hashimoto. I don't know if folks have heard of him, but he was kind of like Trump before Trump, a very populist mayor, just says some really outrageous stuff. But he came up with this idea, and the project is, it aims to like really intensively focus some resources on the neighborhood to address problems like a shrinking and aging population. They're trying to target crime, illegal dumping, limit welfare receipts and welfare fraud. That was kind of a controversial thing, that they were going to really crack down on welfare fraud, and reduce street homelessness and health problems like tuberculosis. Kamagasaki, in addition to being like the largest concentration of poverty in Japan, it has the largest concentration of TB, and things like that. But some of the things they did I've mentioned here. But it aims to change the district's image and attract young families and businesses, was what it was initially stated to do. And it's really ambitious project. Like they said, if we can tackle these problems in Kamagasaki, we can show the entire country how to address these problems of, rapid aging, a lot of single elderly, people that are very susceptible to lonely death, korokushi, and things like that. If we can address those issues here, we can do it throughout the city and the country. But in addition to the government project, there's a lot of market forces that are really pushing the gentrification along. Anybody that's been in Japan recently, it would be hard not to notice the massive increase in tourism. There's also a lot of Chinese investment in the neighborhood, a lot of hotels. There's been investment from China, as well as karaoke bars in the neighborhood, and a lot of the residents look at these karaoke bars as being preying on the welfare recipients who are very lonely. So they'll have Chinese young women working at these karaoke bars, calling in the lonely welfare recipient to come drink away his welfare check. But they're just popping up all over the place. And there's one Chinese investor who's talked about just transforming the whole neighborhood into a Chinatown, just turning it into a Chinatown. But part of this Nishinari Toku Koso, I don't want to be completely skeptical about it. And the local government worked really, really hard because they'd been opposed for so long as just neglecting the neighborhood. They worked really, really hard to get input from the local community. One example of that is they had this series of meetings throughout the fall of 2014. And I think I'd like to offer this as an example of machizukuri, or Japanese-style community development that's really supposed to be bottom-up. And the proponents of this really try to push this as an example of like real democracy, real democratic redevelopment of a local community. And so they put together this group, Airin Chiki no Machizukuri Kento Kaigi, and they were really active in recruiting any kind of community organization to get their input. And so they put together this group that covered a lot of diverse organizations. If folks know about neighborhood associations or chonaikai in Japan, they can be really conservative, most often representing small businesses in a neighborhood. So they got those folks on board. They had academics there. They had the social service providers, some of whom had never thought of kind of working with government. That was the last thing they wanted to do. One of my close friends, who's a day laborer and an activist, said, and who had been kind of investigated by the police for some of his activism, said, used the term harao. He had to like split open his stomach, harao waru, and like really kind of, it was tough for him to work with the government, but he had to just kind of do it. So they had the labor unions involved as well. And they were really open about all of the materials in this process, discussing how the neighborhood should change. And so they put everything up on YouTube, all the community meetings, and all the materials were published on the local ward website. This is just one example of the shirio, or the materials that they put out there. One great thing about doing research, it's kind of in Japan, it's kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time, is a lot of groups produce a lot of materials, so you have a lot of information, but the curse part of it is you have to kind of go through all of it And as not a native speaker of Japanese, sometimes it takes me a long time, but they would put together these graphs of everybody that was participating in these meetings and where they were sitting, so you could tell who was saying what. And these are all the community members that were participating. There were some groups in the community that decided not to participate formally in these meetings, but to oppose it from outside. So they would come and just be yelling during the meetings. I think the first meeting, they weren't able to talk about much because there were so many people opposing things. But eventually they were able to kind of calm people down and have productive discussions and things like that, and incorporate feedback from some of the protesters. But here are some of the changes in the neighborhood. So they opened up a consolidated elementary and junior high school in the neighborhood. That was one of the things they tried to do to attract families. But there was a park right across the street from it where people were living in tents, and they didn't want to have people living in tents right across the street from an elementary and junior high school, so they cleared out the tents. And so some activists put up this sign saying, congratulations for the opening of your school, but don't tear down our tents. As you can see, kind of some of the conflict in the neighborhood. And this is what's going to be torn down at the end of the month, the Airin Rodo Fukushisogo Senta. And you can see up on the second floor up here, a lot of men, this is where they spend their time during the day. They might be recycling all night and then sleep here during the day. They're going to tear this down at the end of the month and move it to a much smaller place kind of under the train tracks right across the street. So people are worried about, what are these people going to be doing during the day? Where are they going to have their spaces to talk to each other, to socialize? Because people really kind of use this space for their daily lives. This is one of the latest publications from the group, that community group that's planning out the redevelopment of the neighborhood. And you can kind of see how they're trying to balance a lot of different things. So they have the service hub in the middle, and then around that, the yellow area is more of the tourist zone where the hotels that cater more to tourists are. But that yellow area used to be part of the Yoseba. That used to be kind of the terrain for day laborers. You can see a bit how that's shrunk a bit. And one of the big things that people point to when they talk about the gentrification of this neighborhood is, you can see at the top, right above Shin Imamiya Station, that little purple area, there's a lot there, but Hoshino Resorts, a big resort, hotel resort company in Japan, bought that land, and they're going to build a big resort hotel right there. And so that's really going to change the neighborhood, is what folks say. They already, right across the street from there, there's already a Don Quixote store there. I don't know how to explain what a Don Quixote is in English, but a lot of junk that's cheap that foreigners love. There's one of those right across the way. So that really kind of highlights a bit some of the changes there. Where my research comes in, there's been some books written by scholars in Japan about this Nishinari Toku Koso and some of the changes going on in the neighborhood. And they're very different. These three books are different takes on it, but they also have some similarities. So the first one is by the economist who led the Nishinari Toku Koso project, and he really describes this democratic process. But he doesn't say anything about what the residents of the neighborhood think. And he just kind of assumes that they don't really have much opinions, that they're really passive. This book here is more critical, and it just assumes that the neighborhood is going to disappear, and that Japan's kind of precarious labor force is not going to have any kind of neighborhood to organize itself around. They're just going to be trapped in internet cafes, in kisaten, internet kisa, and manga kisa, and things like that. And they're just going to have to, if they're going to organize, they're going to have to organize in cyberspace. But the neighborhood's just going to be gone. And this book kind of assumes that the men didn't really care too much about the changes in the neighborhood because they're so migratory that they've never really settled down and they don't have an attachment to the neighborhood, so they don't really care and they're really passive. But that really clashed with what I was seeing in the neighborhood. So this is the last bit of my research that I'll talk about. But after reading those books, I just thought, they're missing the voices of the residents in the neighborhood. And I'd done some interviews, and so I tried to quickly put together an article in Japanese. And luckily, the peer review process in Japan is a lot quicker than maybe not so rigorous as in the US, and so I was able to sneak an article out real quickly. But it looks at how the residents themselves perceived all these changes. And basically what I try to argue here is that the perceptions of the neighborhood changes differed by housing status. So the men who were in stable housing and the supportive housing, they worried a bit about what would happen to people on the streets, but they themselves didn't really feel threatened. They thought because they were on welfare, because of that livelihood protection system, they were safe, that they wouldn't be kicked out of the neighborhood or anything like that. But the people who were in less stable housing, so people on the streets or people living in shelters, I argue that they saw it as a threat to their ontological security. And that's just kind of a fancy word for their subjective sense of security and their ability to form an identity, their ability to plan for the future. They saw this project as a threat to that. And I'll just present some of the data that shows that. And I was able to present this research at the Nishinari Shiminkan in Osaka this past summer. And I got to amuse a lot of people by trying to read the quotes in Osaka Ben. And I'm really bad at that. I'm more of a Tokyo gaijin. So I got a lot of laughs from that, but I'll save you all from that and just read it in English. But this was a guy who was living on the streets and working as a recycler. But he said, this Nishinari Tokukoso makes me feel insecure. Hashimoto is saying that in 3 years he's going to get rid of shelters and soup lines. If that's the case, there's going to be riots. If there aren't any soup lines, to put it bluntly, that is like telling everyone to die, right? Humans can find a place to sleep, but they can't go without eating. If there's no food, there will be riots. Hashimoto will be the one to get killed. There are old people. Even if they're on welfare, they need the soup lines. You're going to just kill them. So you can see how he's kind of seeing this as a threat to constancy in his life. He was kind of dependent on soup lines to eat. This is an example of how it was a threat to the ability to plan for the future. So this guy was saying that as this redevelopment progresses, I'll probably go home to Kagoshima even if I have to walk. If I have money, I'll take a train part of the way. I'll gamble to pay for the train fare. I'll bet on the boat races and win. I don't play pachinko, but I do bet on boats. I can go home easily if I make about $500. So a lot of the men were really stoic. Like they would say that, if the neighborhood really changes, if this plan kicks people out, no problem, I'll just go somewhere else. But they didn't really have a realistic plan for the future. Like the rest of this interview, I asked him a little bit more about his plan, and he was saying his plan kind of fell apart. He was like, well, if I go to Kagoshima, I can't really talk to my family. I can't see my family because I haven't talked to them in 20 years. They won't really welcome me. I asked him, what would you do for a job if you go to Kagoshima? He said, well, I'll be a taxi driver. But my license expired, and I don't know how I'll get my license renewed. So even though they were really stoic, they weren't able to formulate really clear plans for the future. Since I'm running out of time, I'll jump a bit, but I think you can see how these people saw it as a threat. This person saw it as a discrimination, which affected his ability to form a valid identity. So just to wrap up, I'm trying to build more towards a direct comparison of these neighborhoods. Here's a really simple comparison, but like I said earlier, Kamagasaki is like this big mega service hub. Sonia is a mini service hub. Gentrification in Kamagasaki is really accelerating. In Sonia, you could say it's near complete. The politics of the neighborhood in Kamagasaki, they're really fiery and dense. In Sonia, it's more diffuse and quiet. And there's some differences in ontological insecurity. Kamagasaki people are more, at least at this point in time, they were more unsure of the future, whereas Sonia, it was just a more generalized loneliness. So in conclusion, I really argue that these neighborhoods do bolster the human security of residents in important ways, and that they provide people with a right to the city, people who are marginalized. So I think they should be preserved, and this value, there is value in these neighborhoods. They shouldn't just be wiped away. And I think one way to preserve them is to kind of preserve that permanent supportive housing, because that really anchors the neighborhoods. Maybe it's not so great to conclude with a question, but a lot of scholars of these neighborhoods tend to argue that they have lessons for Japan because of, I guess, broader society in Japan, because a lot of the problems in these neighborhoods are just really intense versions of what broader Japan is seeing, like aging, a lot of aging and isolation, and some older neighborhoods are that aren't Yoseba are also seeing gentrification. So do these neighborhoods have lessons for broader Japan? I'll just close there. Thank you.
So we have time for 10 minutes for questions.
Yes.
Okay, this is the right distance. I noticed during your speech on the notions of death to the in the Yoseba community that there was, at least anecdotally, a sense that death wouldn't be so bad because of my community in sorts. And I noticed there are some similarities in my mind to a sort of Irish idea of death that I've seen, where the worst thing that can happen is that you go to hell with your friends. So out of curiosity, what do you think is the general stance on what is the mindset around funerals in these Yoseba? Is it like somber, or is it more like an Irish style wake where you're happy while you're sad?
Right, that's a great question. From the few that I've witnessed, there were more somber, but there was some of kind of celebration of the life. And I've heard men talk about their friend's death as positive, in the sense that their friend's suffering and loneliness has ended. So that could be kind of a universal thing, that there is some sadness, but also a celebration of life, the person's life as well. But they generally overwhelmingly talked about this grave as a positive thing, and that to the darker alternative of just being their remains put in a kind of an anonymous grave for Muen Botoke, but that they would be kind of having this afterlife that's almost like a party.
Kind of bouncing off that last question there that you kind of left open, what parts do you take from this research that you think is applied to our situations here in the States? You briefly mentioned some other research in certain areas,
right.
But is there something that you would point out that we could take away from it that would either be beneficial or something not to do here that you've found in your research?
Yeah, I think although that the last part that I presented was a little bit critical of the Nishinari Toku Koso Machizukuri approach, I think, but I haven't seen anything that participatory in the US. Maybe this idea of Machizukuri, Japanese style, really bottom up, getting opinions of residents in the redevelopment of neighborhoods, and having these very open public meetings and encouraging participation, even from the people that oppose the redevelopment. I think that there could be a lot learned there. I studied Skid Row, Los Angeles, in a similar neighborhood in Miami, and there isn't much dialogue between the community groups, at least those that are somewhat more radical, and the local government. So I think there can be something to be learned for sure.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, my question is very much connected to the previous one. I was wondering if you could reflect more on the idea and strategy of comparison. What kind of encouragement or lessons did you get from comparing? Where did it limit you? Why one case was not enough? And what kind of implicit comparisons or contrasting were still present in your work, but you didn't make that explicit in your presentation now?
Right. Yeah, there are pluses and minuses of comparative research, I think, but since I'd long been interested in Japan, I wanted to do research in Japan and I'd been interested or concerned about homelessness in the United States as well, but I started to do research in Japan. And I could have just done a dissertation on homelessness in Japan, but I thought that, I'm an American and I'm US based, and I planned to work in the United States, so I didn't want to just neglect that side of things. I wanted to do research in the United States as well. I guess that's more of a personal reason, but kind of more analytically, why there's positives is that sometimes the differences just really jump out when you have comparative research, and that wouldn't jump out so clearly if you just had one case study, I guess. And so in comparing the US and Japan, I can point out in Japan, they have this system called seikatsu hogo, and it's basically it almost works like a guaranteed minimum income, and it provides a social safety net that we don't have here in the United States. And that's not the entire reason, but that's one of the reasons why we have something like 30 to 40 times larger a homeless population. It's actually become even bigger of a difference over the years. So some of those differences really just jump out. And like in the United States, homelessness, race is a huge component of it, but people don't really think about that so much. It's kind of taken for granted if you just look at the United States, but then when you bring the Japanese side of things there, and you don't have like mass incarceration of a specific, of African Americans like you do in the United States. You don't have of a minority group in Japan. So those types of things really stand out clearly. And in the end, Japan looks a lot better than the US in terms of how it addresses poverty. I don't know if that addressed the full question. But.
Can I react to that?
Sure.
So based on your research on comparing these two cases, two countries, and did it help you then to come back to theory and to alter the definition of gentrification, for example? Because the mechanism behind gentrification, even though it may look the same in different locations, it's not the same.
Right.
So would you reconsider what gentrification is or what it does to people?
Right. Yeah, I think so. So maybe this is an example of the mechanisms of gentrification, how it made me re-understand those things. And I think this isn't just unique to Japan, but a lot of kind of East Asian countries as well, is that in Japan, there's not as much of a sentiment of, what do they say? Like grime is glamorous. Like in the US and the Western model of gentrification, it's always artists that are first. They find a poor neighborhood, and part of the grime and the grittiness of the neighborhood is what attracts the young people. And then they go in and start, that's kind of cool, and they kind of transform the neighborhood. That doesn't work at all in Japan. There's not like a young, the quote unquote hipster population that wants to live in Kamagasaki and that's moving in. There's not really much of that, even though there are the murals and stuff like that that might seem to, cater towards that younger population. There isn't that side of gentrification driving it. It's more of like tourism gentrification. So younger folks, a lot of younger folks in Japan they still have that stigma of those neighborhoods, and they don't want to really live there, which is interesting. I thought.
My question was, so first of all, in those Doya, you said they're about 2 tatami mats wide. For those of us who don't really have a very good idea of how wide 2 tatami mats are, could you give it to us in like a unit of feet or inches or centimeters or anything that's not?
Right, I can't remember this off the top of my head. I'm not so great with math, but I think it was like 9 square feet. That might be too small.
This is like one.
Yeah, this is about a tatami mat.
A little bit bigger, but yeah, like this is one.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you.
2 and then a half of one.
Okay, great.
Actually, there's a Doya up there. I think there's like 2.
Free housing. Free housing from the university. Another question about the Doya. I know you said that they were very like cheap housing and that you stayed in one. Is it, in those neighborhoods, is it frowned upon for tourists to come in and like live in those spaces or like rent out those spaces because I mean, this is like their space, and I guess you were talking about how like the gentrification of these areas includes like a lot more like tourists coming in, and would it be seen as, I guess, invading these working people's spaces, or do they just see it as somebody who's traveling who doesn't have a lot of money?
I think, I mean, so many of these have been converted, and they kind of overtly market themselves to tourists. It's just kind of become accepted. And I think there was a newspaper article about these neighborhoods and the changes and the tourists. And basically they described that the 2 worlds just are separate. I mean, they're side by side, but they don't really cross over much. And this newspaper article argued that that's almost like the future of Japan, that it's going to be kind of a lot of poor older people who live, you know, in one world, and then, you know, a lot of foreigners who live in their own separate world. So what I see in the neighborhoods is that the 2 worlds are really close to each other, but they don't like cross over very much at all.
Hi.
But
would you like to continue with your third?
So is it seen as preferable for these foreigners, I guess, to like stay in capsule hotels, for example? I know you mentioned those. Versus like for cheap housing versus the Doyas? For those who live in the area.
How the residents perceive. I think, you know, I didn't, in interviews and observation, the men didn't really say, oh, those damn foreigners are, you know, invading the neighborhood. They just kind of saw it as, you know, this is the time, changing of the times. Yeah.
I have a question of clarification followed by a question. Did I hear that the homeless population here in America is 30 to 40% or 30 to 40 times that of Japan?
Right. Thank you. I don't think I said that clearly, but you know, my previous research project was on homelessness in Los Angeles and Tokyo, and the two countries use different definitions of homelessness. So in Japan, it's only if you're literally on the streets, but they count, right, you know, each year they'll count people on the streets. In the U.S., it varies by locality, but they generally consider people in shelters homeless as well. So you kind of have to like really massage the numbers to get, you know, what you're looking at the same thing. But I did that in my book, and at that time, this was the early 2000s. Just comparing Tokyo and Los Angeles, and just comparing street homelessness, Los Angeles had 30 times more than Tokyo. But since then, Tokyo's decreased and Los Angeles has increased. So now it's probably like 60, 70%.
In your
Or
comparison,
70 times.
going back nearly 20 years, did you take into account the population difference between the two cities? Or the population of the, quote, homeless people in those
Right.
two cities? Or in other words, I'm actually going after, on a per capita basis, what
Right.
is actually the difference?
That's per capita too.
That is per capita.
Right, right. But yes, but Tokyo's population is roughly the same as Los Angeles, but I did adjust for slight differences, right?
My real question, Japan is a low crime society. I'm just wondering, these homeless people in either Osaka or Tokyo or other cities in Japan, on a per capita basis, are these people more likely to be victims of crime? And if so, how much more?
Right.
And for what reasons? For what reasons? Either better or worse?
Right. There were a lot of very kind of public cases of, mostly kids. Different words I've heard like itazara or ijime, like shooting fireworks at people who are homeless. Because they're in parks and tents, and kids messing around with fireworks. A dumb teenager that isn't really thinking, shooting fireworks. Even more serious than that, there was a man I was talking to who lived on this rows of the banks of the Sumida River, where it's cement, it's a walkway, but there's a wall, a big wall, and then there's an above area where there's a park. A kid dropped a car battery that he had found above onto his tent, and the guy said he could have died, if he was in his tent at the time, but luckily he was out. So there's incidents like that in the. Of course, this happens in the U.S. too, but of kids setting a tent on fire or things like that. But street homelessness has decreased, so I think those incidents have decreased. And there's some groups that have gone into elementary schools to talk about homelessness to try to prevent these crimes.
Let me put that question another way. Based on your experience observation, do you think the homeless people in the areas you study are more likely to be or become victims of crime compared to their counterparts here in America?
Hold yourself. We don't have time, so we'll take two questions, and
Yep.
then you can answer all
Sure,
three
sure,
questions.
sure. Great.
Okay, I'll just first. I just had a question about the resistant necropolitics section on
What politics? Could you speak about it, please?
Resistant necropolitics.
necropolitics. So, my understanding of it, and I just want clarification
Sure.
here, is that it's using death to protest against oppression from a greater political entity. So for your example, with the Buddhist graveyard, that was your example of resistant necropolitics. But the way I'm understanding it is you celebrate death to go to protest against an oppressive force. But was this graveyard considered an eyesore by the political forces that were oppressing these people, or was it just their way of empowering themselves to to resist in their own way, but
Right.
it's not actually fighting back? To clarify that.
Yeah, I'll take one more question, then I'll clarify that.
As with the policy recommendation in your last slide, the preservation of supportive housing, did Nishinari Talk also include that kind of policy? If so, do you think it fails to work or not?
Right.
And why?
Great. Thank you. Okay, so 2 minutes. So are people who are living on the streets in Japan more likely to be victims of crime than here? I don't think so. I think, you know, American society is a higher crime society, more violence. Yeah, and even when I was doing my field work in Skid Row, Los Angeles, a person who was living on the street was shot and killed by a police officer in an altercation. You know, that would not happen in Japan. You know, seen police officers in Irene or Kamagasaki and Sonia breaking up fights, and it's not like they're throwing handcuffs on people. They're like ma 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 ma, like, and no one gets arrested. That one's a tough one. Let me maybe one-on-one address that one. The Nishinari Toku Koso, they are aware of the need to preserve these the supportive housing, but like in this little graph, you know, this is where the middle is where the supportive housing is. So, you know, they're definitely, you know, the local government will say, yes, we want to preserve the social services and the, you know, the cheap housing, the supportive housing here, but this place is in decline. It's kind of got to shrink, you know, and the Doya owners too, they have to make their money. We don't want to just keep sending welfare residents here. So tourism, you know, we want to improve the economy of the whole ward, and tourism is a big thing. You know, it's very visible in this neighborhood. You know, the tourists really coming in. It's easy to get to Kanku, the Kansai airport. It's very, very easy to get to Universal Studio Japan. It's very easy to get to Nara, Kyoto. So they want to take advantage of that and attract the tourist industry, but at the same time preserve the supportive housing. Is kind of, they're trying to do both, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor Marr for his presentation.
Thank you all.